I'll actually start recording this too. Just to clarify, we will do chapters 12 and 13 today. We'll do 14 through 16 then next week on Tuesday. And then your course material will be complete. You won't have to come back next Thursday or the week after Thanksgiving. However, I will be available to you for help if you need help with your speech or if you have questions. You can always stop by to see me. I do plan to be out on Monday the 30th, which wouldn't have impacted your class time at all anyway. But so on the 1st and the 3rd, I will be online during this time. If anybody has any questions, you're also welcome to stop by to ask those questions. If I'm not in the classroom, I'll be upstairs in my office. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and move forward. Let's go ahead and get started on chapters 12 and 13. We switch over so you guys online, you're going to see the crazy screen for a minute. Okay, crazy screen, and now lecture notes. Covering chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 is about Cotton, King Cotton, and chapter 13 is the Second Great Awakening. So we'll get right to those. So antebellum, the word itself, antebellum, just means the years before the war. In this case, we're talking specifically the years before the Civil War. And just to kind of put things into perspective, the South grew tobacco and rice, but cotton became the main commerce. So tobacco, we know, was an early crop that the young nation depended on. Rice came later, and then cotton. Cotton became king of all the crops. It was a cash crop, which means that it was sold for profit instead of just the farmer's use. So these people aren't subsistence farming with cotton. They're growing cotton in order to harvest and sell cotton. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793. And so this cotton gin would pull seeds away from raw cotton. And it actually increased the need for slave labor. You might think, well, if we have machinery doing some of this work, you're not going to need as many slaves in that instance. However, it just pulled the seeds from the cotton. You still needed a lot of people to pick cotton. So because you could pick a lot of cotton, they wanted, because they could seed a lot of cotton, they wanted more of it to be picked so that they could, they could still have more and more and more cotton. The cotton gin could process 50 pounds of cotton per day. But if slaves were picking seeds out by hand, it was 1 pound of cotton per day. So you can see how the cotton gin was really very efficient. Eli Whitney himself didn't make a lot of money from the cotton gin. There were some patent issues with it, and he never made a lot of money from it. However, he did get a major contract to build muskets for the government. Hang on just a second. I got to make sure I turn the microphone on. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And make sure you guys could hear me. Eli Whitney did get a major contract from the government to make muskets. And his idea was that if they made a standard musket, they could make interchangeable parts, which meant they could be repaired. And it also meant that there was some of the artisanry taken out of it, because with those standard parts, you could assemble things easier too. So it wasn't just so much, oh, here's one musket, here's another musket. By them all using the same parts, that they went together faster. And so more like, I'm not going to call it an assembly line process because that kind of manufacturing wasn't a thing yet, but it was definitely an early piece of progress in American manufacturing. So we know that when Jefferson became president, he had this vision of a nation of agriculture. And to Jefferson, what this meant was a lot of small farmers, white farmers, who were successful on their individual plots of land. They would make enough for their families. They might sell some, in communities and all of that stuff. But the reality of what happened was really different, because as cotton becomes the king crop of the time period, we have farmers who are clear-cutting land in order to grow cotton. Then when they're through with it, they move on, because land seemed indispensable. I mean, just there was so much land. It seemed dispensable, I guess would be the better phrase. But they'd finish with a piece of land and they just moved to another piece of land instead of kind of reworking the soil and that sort of thing. So when the soil got tired, they just moved on. Slavery grew from these huge plantations. Now, the plantation owners weren't the only people who had slaves, but it was the vast majority of the reason for slavery in the South. Cotton was planted in March and April, and it required constant weeding, so that was daily work for slaves. It would bloom in August, and then it was picked by hand, which is long, laborious work. You're bent over most of that time, so it's back-breaking labor. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen cotton. I'm sure that I'll mention Destin specifically because I know that he worked in Pine Bluff for a while, and I'm hoping that maybe he got to drive by a cotton field there. Have any of you guys seen cotton fields? Edie has, so.
I was like, there's a lot of them on the road to like Memphis.
Yeah. A lot of them on the road to Memphis for sure. Hang on, let's see who we got coming in. Jacob, yes. Okay. And Jessica has too. Yeah, so, yeah, Destin. Okay, cool. But it's kind of prickly, and it can make your fingers bleed, and anyway, rough stuff. Not pleasant. I mean, it's also soft looking when we see it as cotton balls, right? In the little bags that we bought for 98 cents, but very different kind of situation. Cotton was also important before we get too far into the transportation of cotton. Cotton was also important because it was used in textile mills, which was really the first inventive kind of industry that we start to see develop in Great Britain when industry was starting to develop there. So, because cotton can be turned into textile or cloth, then it was very important. Steamships were the primary way of transporting cotton early on because they were what we had. In 1817, there were only 17 steamships across the western rivers, but by 1837, there were 700, and well, actually more than 700 steamships in operation. So we had major ports in the west and in the south as St. Louis, Missouri, Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Also during this time period, the domestic slave trade became big business. We've talked before about the African slave trade. This is domestic slave trade because in 1807, Congress abolished foreign slave trade, which meant that we would no longer get ships from Africa of slaves. But it did not end domestic slavery or domestic slave trade. Now, there was still some smuggling that still happened, but the biggest market was here in the U.S. White slave owners sold slaves for big profits, and even slave brokers became a big business. So people who would say, I can find you slaves if you need slaves, that kind of middleman developed. There was another business that grew from the domestic slave trade too, because when you had slaves, you had to have somewhere to keep them until they could be delivered to their final destination. It's like we're talking about people like their Amazon package at this point, but there were pens that people could rent in order to keep slaves in until their delivery, and warehouses where slaves would stay until they were able to be delivered for their profit. Between 1790 and 1859, Virginia alone, Virginia slave holders, that should be holders with an S, sold more than 500,000 slaves. In the 1800 census, there were more than 1 million African Americans listed, but 900,000 of those were slaves. And as you know, slaves were sold apart from their family or friends. They were simply viewed as straight up property. So in terms of the world market, the South thought that their cotton, some Southerners, I shouldn't say the South as a whole, but some Southerners thought that their cotton crop gave them independence from the North's growing industrialization. But the North was actually very dependent on the South for cotton for their textile mills. 75% of the U.S. cotton was exported abroad, and the U.S. was actually a world leader in cotton production at this time period. From 1820 to 1860, 80% of the world's cotton came from the United States. Again, most of that was shipped to Great Britain. But the South's focus on cotton meant that it was dependent in other areas, like, boy, I can't spell anything at night when I type slides, so that should say west, not westy, but corn and pork came from the west to the South. Inexpensive clothing, which was called slobs, or slops. The slops were from the North. And home furnishings, like decorations and dinnerware, that kind of stuff, largely came from the North too. And some upholstered goods and china, that kind of stuff, that fancy dinnerware, books, and some musical instruments even came from abroad, as well as from the North. So while cotton was king in the South, we really needed some other things that we didn't produce here. Now, you know, playing Monday morning quarterback, we could look back and say they should have produced this stuff here, and then they would have been totally independent as far as, you know, North from South, and the North would have been very dependent on the South, which it already was for cotton. When we talk about slavery in these terms, we're talking about chattel slavery, which is when you hold these enslaved people as property. In this case, it was Africans or blacks. This is very different from indentured servitude. We talked about that before. Indentured servitude is when you work off a fine or you work off a debt. Indentured servants could often go home and come back the next day. So it's not like they were being held always. Chattel slavery was straight out, I own you. You belong to me forever until I decide to, out of the kindness of my heart, to let you go. While some slaves were on small farms, most Southern slaves served on plantations. And there were many hardships associated with slavery. The living conditions were poor. Cabins were small at best, and they usually had a number of people in them. They rarely had enough food, which was ironic because they were the ones growing the food. There was a spread of diseases like cholera and hepatitis because the living conditions were so poor. As I've already mentioned, specifically with cotton, the labor in the fields was backbreaking, and there was physical abuse associated with many slave instances, like sometimes the overseer would be very abusive, but the owner might not be. So there were times when an overseer would go too far with whipping or beating a slave, and then the slave owner would release the overseer, would fire him because he had been too mean or abusive. It wasn't always the case, but sometimes it was. Also, one of the hardships was that families could be separated by slavery because these people were viewed as property, not as a family unit. So very many times unions were created, you know, like arranged marriages, or sometimes slaves were allowed to pick who they wanted to marry, but reproduction was always encouraged because that's increasing the labor force. And not just increasing the labor force, you know, if you needed to make some quick money, you could sell someone into slavery. So they might take a husband and sell him to somebody else, or a wife or a kid, and sell them to other people with no regard for the humanity of it all. And of course, sexual harassment and rape of slave women was also an issue. So slave life was based on this concept called paternalism, which basically meant that it was this concept that the white owners acted in the best interest of their slaves, that they took responsibility for their care, their feeding, their discipline, their Christianity, and the idea that they were doing something good for people who might not otherwise have had these opportunities. So opportunities there would be in air quotes, but that was kind of a way to justify slavery. The idea that, like with Manifest Destiny, how the pioneers felt like they were taming the savages in the West by, kind of enculturalizing the Native Americans. People are kind of looking at that the same way for slavery, where the white slave owners were, kind of taming these savages. The stereotypes of the slaves gave them a way to resist. So we have this paternalism system, which kind of implies that these people can't take care of themselves. These slaves are taking care of a full economy. I mean, they're the ones that are doing all of the labor. They're getting very little for doing it. So the idea that these people were simple and could do nothing else was really kind of, it was really a stereotype. The idea that they were childlike or had to have someone else look out for them was wrong, but some of the slaves were able to use that to their benefit. So they would kind of play on this childlike innocence and break tools or slow down work to kind of catch a break here and there. So, the slaves are creatively acting out and trying to be safe about doing it. Some of them ratted each other out for this kind of thing. So like one slave might notice that another slave is pretending to have broken something and that he didn't know how to fix it or something like that. And another slave might tell the overseer or the owner about it, and then that slave who told, the tattle slave, would get special treatment because they felt like he was looking out for the owner's best interest. As I've already mentioned, some disciplinary measures included the threat of selling people away from family and friends. Whippings were common, which sometimes left people unable to work and even killed them. The idea that you're going to whip somebody as a disciplinary measure to make them work harder when it actually debilitates them is just kind of a frustrating thing to think about. I mean, frustrating today. It was crucial then, and like I said, left many people unable to work or even killed them. Also, as I mentioned already, some of the whippings were by the overseer, not the master himself, and there were times when the master would fire an overseer for going too far. And I've also already mentioned about the reproduction of slaves because they were breeding people for profit. Many slaves embraced Christianity because it gave them some kind of hope. The masters at first thought it would be kind of dangerous because remember, we're operating still at this time under the old slave codes that came about from the rebellion that we watched the other day. We'll mention it here again in a few minutes, but these slave codes that did not allow slaves to congregate, much less to learn anything. And this whole idea that they could learn about Christianity, together as slaves seemed kind of dangerous to some white people. They didn't want the black slaves to have this opportunity to congregate like that. But masters kind of reconciled this with the idea that Christianity teaches obedience and that it would be okay. It would be okay for the slaves to have church. Also, during this time, to make matters more complicated, there are free blacks in the South. There were about 261,000 free blacks in the slave states and 226,000 in the North. So you would think that some of these slaves would have gone north, but there was work in the South. Most of the free blacks didn't live in the deep South like where we're located. They lived in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. And they were free largely because of manumission, as we've talked about before, this formal granting of freedom to slaves by their masters. We know that the Revolutionary War inspired some manumission, and then lack of labor needs for wheat in the North and in the West also led to manumission, because people didn't want to be responsible for slaves that they didn't need, so because that cost food and supplies, so they released some of those slaves. Many of the slaves who were free, or many of the free blacks, I should say, lived in cities. And there were more lighter-skinned women who lived in the cities. And that was evidence of the interracial relationships between slaves and masters. The color of a freedman's skin had a lot to do with their place in society. We'll talk a little about that in just a minute, but the idea that someone was black, even if they were free, was always associated with slavery. I mean, they had either been a slave or had been the product of slavery. And that creates, this visual of a black person gave white people then this sense of hierarchy that was based on the color of a person's skin. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that obviously the richest people were at the top of the social ladder. The poorest white people were not at the bottom of the social ladder. They were at the bottom of the white part of the social ladder. Underneath them was a whole segment of black people going down it started with skin color. The darkest black person was at the lowest social level. The lighter the skin tone, the higher the social level. I mean, think about that for a minute. So we had a whole social hierarchical system based on skin color. Now, there were some free blacks who owned slaves, and some of them amassed really large fortunes, but that was really rare. There was a man, a freed slave in Louisiana, who had been the product of an interracial relationship, who inherited some land and some property, or some land and slaves. So he actually owned slaves too, and a huge sugarcane crop, and he was very, very wealthy. But again, that was the exception rather than the rule. Nat Turner's rebellion is the one I referenced just a minute ago, where Turner and his group killed 60 white people, including many women and children, before they were finally captured. Turner and 16 followers were executed. And then rumors of this is what I was telling you about the other day, rumors of this spread that this uprising was leading to a national problem, which then increases this fear of black people. Now, this goes into New York even, where people are talking about this uprising. And New York turns it into a fear of Catholicism. Well, the Catholics are fighting in there too. So it was just like this big rumor that got spread all across the country. Mass panic among white populations that came from this kind of rumor actually brought in militias to attack and kill black people. Obviously, much of that was senseless, because this was a small rebellion in terms of Nat Turner's rebellion. It wasn't a nationwide problem, but it was presented as such, and this fear fueled these attacks against Black people. So I want to show you this because the other day I was very much staunch in the fact that slavery is the cause of the Civil War. And so I wanted to show you this graph and explain that a little bit. So you might say, well, if that's true, how is it that 76.1% of people in the South were non-slaveholders? How could it have been about slavery if only, if 24% or 23.9% even bothered owning slaves? How can that be the cause of the Civil War? It goes back to that social hierarchy. There is something that I know I've studied in literature, but it's also a psychological focus called othering. So, and I don't know that we think about it very much. There's always an other person. So, you know, like an outcast or something. So in terms of society, especially at this particular time, the 1820s to 1860s in the South, the social structure was very much based on race. We've just talked about it. White people were at the top of the social structure and Black people were at the bottom of the social structure. And that was by the design of slavery. We talked too about how even among freed Blacks, the social status was totally based on the color of skin. So again, and because we know that the color of skin was always associated with slavery, you know, that's where I get my argument that slavery was the base of the Civil War. It was the root cause. It was the thing that we fought over. So here, yes, 76% of the South didn't even have slaves, but 76% of the South, 76% of the white people in the South wanted to be in a better social class. So, boom, that's where I will leave that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. I looked at Edie going, does that even... Anyway, my brother and I were talking about this last night, and it was a long conversation. Anyway, in the 1830s, slaveholders worried about losing slavery and the honor of white Southerners. So that's another term that goes back to this social structure, the hierarchy based on the color of one's skin, the honor of white Southerners. Now, I'm not going to get into pride or heritage, you know, Southern pride or Southern heritage pride, that sort of thing, because I think we all have different concepts of that. But when I talk about here the honor of white Southerners, I'm specifically referring to people who wanted to maintain a social class higher than someone, and that's where the Blacks or the freed Blacks or the slaves came into play here. I mean, this was how white people, even the lowest economic class of white person, was somehow able to stay, you know, socially above the darker skinned people. So the tariff of 1828, which we talked about in the last chapter, the tariff of abominations, appeared to John C. Calhoun as proof that the North really wanted to destroy the South's economy and culture. So when you put those two things together, the economy, which we know was based on slavery, and the culture, which was based on slavery, we're talking about that hierarchy again. So it's really impossible to pull out that hierarchical system from the lives of these people in this time period. Calhoun thought that the tariff would hurt the South but benefit the North. And as a representative from North Carolina, that's when he encouraged them to start doing this process of nullification, which we've already talked about. There was a Harvard professor, Agassiz, who defended slavery. He said that human races came from different origins. Different human races came from different origins, and that Black people were a whole different race from white people. And this is called polygenism. I want to show you this picture. The idea that different human races have different origins. So, and there's this image here that, and we're not talking specifically Darwin at this point, but we do have a chimp here at the bottom, and then we have a Black man here, and then we have the idealized Greek here. So the idea was that somehow that there was this progression, and that enculturalized people like the Greeks were white. Anyway, picture blew my mind. I thought I'd share that with you. It's in the book. Okay, chapter 13, going on into that. So chapter 13, we're talking about the Great Awakening, which was this evangelical movement of the early 19th century that focused on outdoor revivals and social reform dedicated to equality and free will. So this is, very much, not going to jive well with slavery, because that's not equality, and slavery is not free will either. So free will is the power of humans to act independently of social, natural, and religious constraints. People who were enslaved obviously had no free will. As reformers began pushing the idea of free will, this becomes more obvious to some people. Now, some people still don't want to look at it that way. Most of the time, people who were profiting largely didn't want to look at it that way. We've talked before about Calvinists too. The Calvinists believed that God predestined people, that some people knew they were going to heaven, and some people were already selected to go to heaven, and some people were not. And that the best way that you could be prepared was to go ahead and do all of these good works now, just in case you were selected, you'd be ready. So we have Calvinists at this particular period of time that are coming up against this new kind of evangelical religion. The evangelicals believed that people could decide to turn away from their sin, that they could make that choice because of free will. So if you have free will, you can decide to choose God or to deny God, that which would totally go against the idea of predestination. They promoted reading the Bible in the way that anyone who could read the Bible could understand God and have a personal relationship with Him. However, we have a lot of slaves here at this time period who can't read. So you can see how this is still very much white or Euro related here. The idea of evangelicalism also is that it was for everyone, not just the chosen people like the Calvinists, not just the rich people or the elite, that it was for everyone, which opens some new ideas for slaves, We also see the development of camp meetings, these large outdoor revivals that lasted sometimes for several days. And there's one called Davidson Camp Meeting in Arkadelphia, or it's actually in Hollywood, Arkansas, if you guys know where that is. Interesting thing about Hollywood, I'll throw in here. So I knew a guy who was mayor of Hollywood, Arkansas. And I don't even know what the population of this little community is, maybe like 40 or something. I mean, it's small. Hollywood is located on Highway 51 between Arkadelphia and Girton, maybe the town that you might know, Okolona. I don't even know. Anyway, it's a little place you drive through, to make my point. It's like smaller than Perla or Poen, it's small. Anyway, but he's the mayor of this community, and we were laughing about, I was laughing about it. He's like, hey, it's important for me to be mayor. I'm like, why is it so important for you to be mayor of Hollywood, Arkansas? Hollywood, California sent a letter to all of the Hollywoods in the United States back in like the late 80s and said, we want to be known as Hollywood, USA. And we can only be known as Hollywood, USA if you will give up your community name and change your name. Well, so there's also a Hollywood, Florida, who got the letter as well. They're a little bit bigger. They're a real town. I hate to say that. God rest his soul. Sorry about that, Mr. Clark. But, anyway, Hollywood, Florida is a real town. And so they contacted all of the other small Hollywood mayors and said, come for a conference. And so they had to elect a mayor of this little Hollywood, Arkansas. And so Mr. Clark was the one that they picked. And they all voted to stay together and to maintain their Hollywood names. So Hollywood, California can't be Hollywood, USA because of a handful of smaller Hollywoods. Anyway, Davidson Campground is just a little past Hollywood. Anyway, I love that somebody rebelled and now Hollywood, California can't have its way. What's that?
I respect the pettiness.
Yeah, I know, right? I respect the pettiness too. So the evangelical movement promoted the growth of Protestant religions and also started black religions too. As I've already mentioned, the idea of Christianity kind of gave slaves hope, which encouraged them through their hardships. But evangelicalism was for everyone, which starts to introduce a religious equality. Now, we're not going to have combined, racial church services for a long time still. But the idea that God is for everyone is, kind of fanatical at this point, kind of radical. I've already mentioned to you that the first slave owners felt like they thought that religion might show the slaves that they deserved equality or that they could congregate and they could maybe rise up or something like that. But the Southerners decided that slaves would be more dedicated to work as Christians, Christian obedience. The evangelical movement emphasized the need for morality in a sinful world. Slave owners worried that that might change slavery. So even in the back of their mind, this idea that they're worried that it might change kind of leads you to realize that they know it's wrong, but it's not hurting them, so they don't really want to do anything about it. This is where we have the concept developed that those who are good go to heaven, those who are bad go to hell. And the evangelical movement was to encourage the masses to be better, which led to social activism. It's not just about being better so you can get to heaven, it's being better and helping other people. The idea of works and charity start coming about in this time period. The first charities were actually small organizations dedicated to converting more Christians. These charities were created to help or cure society's problems. But the issue here is that not everyone sees the same thing as a problem. There were temperance groups that are forming at this time. Temperance groups focused on eliminating drinking alcohol. I should be more specific there. So when you hear stuff about the temperance movement, it was the anti-alcohol movement. There were Magdalene societies that focused on the issue of prostitution, trying to get rid of prostitution. And the abolition movement starts growing too, out of the idea that if we're talking about Christian equality, then how can we justify slavery? So we start to have people who establish groups who want to abolish slavery. And this divided people. There were people in the North who weren't necessarily opposed to slavery, and there were people in the South who were opposed to slavery. So it's not just a simple North and South issue. It divided people all over the country. And we mentioned the Underground Railroad, or the video we saw last time mentioned the Underground Railroad, which was a system of safe houses that led slaves to freedom, is not really like a subway or anything. I know that was my daughter's first thought when she was in 3rd grade and they were talking about the Underground Railroad. She wanted to know how it ran and people didn't hear it. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, oh, okay, no, it's not like a subway. You know, it's just a series of safe houses that you could go to and hide in, and they would get you to freedom. Have you guys heard about slave quilts? Heard about slave quilts? So there's a story or folklore. We really don't know it for sure. Depending on where you look, you'll find evidence as though it's a real thing. I haven't seen enough evidence to really prove to myself that it's a real thing, but I love the folklore of it. There's this idea that people used quilts in order to guide people through the Underground Railroad, where to go for the next safe house. And like, there is this quilt called, let me go to a picture of one, a log cabin quilt. I don't know if I have any quilters here. Okay, so here's a log cabin quilt, right here. Yeah, something, yeah. And I guess it's because of the way the rectangles kind of butt up against each other. But in the center, there's a solid color square. And the folklore is that if the square in the center was black, that meant it was a safe house or a black print. You know, that house was a safe house. And if you were a runaway slave, you could go there for safety. I don't know that that's true. There were also stories that different quilt patterns meant different things at different seasons. Like a particular star quilt would mean something if it were displayed on the front porch during a particular season. So why would people hang quilts out? That's how they cleaned them. They couldn't throw them in a washing machine or anything like that. So it's not like it necessarily brought up a lot of, it wasn't a red flag to the community. Oh, you know, the Pennington family's got a quilt on their front, they must be helping slaves. It wasn't like that. In order to clean a quilt, you had to hang it out in the sun, and you had to beat the quilt because you couldn't throw it in your large-scale washing machine and put some all free and clear in there. That stuff wasn't around yet, so had to put them outside and let them hang for freshness. But anyway, like I said, I haven't seen enough proof to really believe that that's 100% true, but it's a great story, you know. So there, folklore, difference between folklore and history. Slave owners forced their slaves to abandon their native cultures. That's something else that was mentioned in the clip that we saw the other day. So other than these forms of resistance that I mentioned, that, you know, maybe breaking a tool or pretending not to know how to do something so they could slow the labor down, one of the things that they could do to deal with their situation was to create new traditions and to hang on to as many of those little elements from their own cultures as they could. During the African slave trade, where, you know, slaves are being imported, it was really hard to do because you had people from different regions being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And so they kind of had to create their own traditions as well. So it was hard to do that, but especially when your family and friends get sold frequently and you don't know how to keep up with people. So the idea of African culture became really important to hang on to. So storytelling and music were important to preserving slave culture because it was illegal to teach slaves to read or write. Most of their, or all of their traditions were told through oral history. There was a Brer Rabbit story. Have you guys heard the story of Brer Rabbit? Anyway, he was a simple rabbit who continually outsmarted the farmer, which was this story that gave encouragement to the slaves because, here's this simple rabbit who is sly and smart enough to outsmart farmers who were by nature white. So this little rabbit is able to outsmart bigger and stronger animals and the farmer in general. Also, there were religious spirituals that encouraged slaves, and we also saw the song that kind of framed this coded message about escape opportunities. Oops, who's got something here? Song of the South, yep. Now I've got the Alabama song, Song of the South, on my mind. Anybody know that? Yeah? Oh, wow. I'm not old and irrelevant anymore. That makes me happy. Okay, we're getting close. Oops, shouldn't close that out. I should make it bigger. Okay. Here we go again. I'm going to kind of throw this out. The Civil War fought about slavery. The states' rights argument, because it was the states' right to keep slavery. The economy argument is invalid because it was that the slave states depended on slavery economically. But like I've already mentioned today, not just economically, but culturally, because we had that social hierarchy where white people are at the top, dark-skinned people are at the bottom. And depending even on the level of darkness there, the idea that a black person with light skin could be higher on a social status because of the light skin implies that, well, I won't tell you what it implies. Can anyone tell me what it implies? So if, according to the South's social hierarchy of the 1860s, if a light-skinned black person can rank higher than a dark-skinned black person, does anyone want to guess the implication there or discuss it? Yeah. Let's see who. They were better off. Yeah, they were better off because, like Edie added, was that light-skinned black people had this implication of white blood. So the genetic mixing with a white person somehow made a black person better. I mean, that's just wow. That's just something. So this is the culture of the South in the 1860s. In the Civil War, and we'll talk more about the Civil War next time, but approximately 700,000 people died. The Union is the North, the Confederates are the South. Sometimes people mix that up on the test, so I wanted to throw that in here so you have it. And it's also important to know that not all slave states seceded from the Union. Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland were slave states that did not secede from the Union. So they still remained part of the Union. The Union had more soldiers. They had 22 million soldiers versus 9 million in the South, and 3.5 million soldiers were slaves, probably not very sympathetic to the South. The North manufactured more goods than the South, which was another advantage over the South. Also at the time, the North had 20,000 miles of railroad and the South only had 10,000. So that's something else that I want to mention here. We'll talk a little more about it in the next chapters, but we started off talking about steam transportation, but we do have rail transportation developing at this point. And the cost for shipping from the South to the North was very high. So it cost the cotton mill or the cotton owners more money to ship their raw cotton to the North than it cost the North to ship back textiles that were complete. So it seemed unfair to the Southerners who were cotton producers that they had to pay so much more in order to send their cotton to the North, because this was the system of taxation at the time. So that's something we will delve into a little bit more. The South's big advantage during the war was its military leaders. They were better than the North's. And we'll talk a little more about them next time too. So we have technically covered chapters 12 and 13. Boom. We got it done. So next time, I'm confident we can cover 14, 15, and 16 and wrap up the semester. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Anything you want to talk about? Edie says no. Hi, Maya. Yes, ma'am.
So I think I'm the only person that hasn't put a topic in the semester thing.
Okay.
I was gonna see, can you just like throw me something and I'll just do it, whatever you choose for me?
I'll look at it and I'll email you after class.
Okay, great.
And if you don't like it, maybe it'll at least give you an idea of something.
No, I just need you to give me a topic. I'm gonna do whatever you give me. I just can't come up with nothing myself.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna have some fun with that then.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? Remember, if you need help recording that, we will have time, since you're not going to have class next Thursday, the Thursday before Thanksgiving. Technically, you won't have class after Thanksgiving, so I can work with you to get these things recorded if you need that help. So don't hesitate to ask. We will have the time. So there's that. All right, well, if there are no more questions, then we are free to go. Oh, wow, the camera moved. That's cool. Bye, Jacob and Jessica. You too, Jessica. Yeah, okay. Yeah, just let me know. I'll help you with the recording.